Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Well, that's a good question. I teach a course, an educational course called From Wizards to Wormholes: Introduction to Fantasy and Sci-Fi Literature, and um, and that um, that course got me reading, from a wide variety of science fiction and fantasy sources. And one thing I began to notice as I started reading authors like Robert A. Heinlein and Gregory Benford, and F. Paul Walden, and Ayn Rand, and many other authors, is that there's a serious libertarian strain, sort of peaks and valleys of libertarian thought that run throughout the history of science fiction, not only in the minds of authors, but in publishing as well. Many of the famous sci-fi editors were liberty-loving people, and then I started reading this book, and I'll hold the book up here. It's called Astounding. It's by Alec Novella Lee. And I started reading more about the influential science fiction writers and editors, and I started realizing that there was a real libertarian strain in science fiction. And the question that precipitated the article that you brought me on to talk about was, what's the connection? Is it necessary or is it contingent, right? Does it just so happen to be the case that libertarians are kind of outcasts and they're imaginative, intelligent people who sit down and write novels, and that's just a coincidence? Or is it the case that there's something to science fiction? Is the soil rich, as I put it in my article, for libertarian themes and ideas? And it turns out that it is a necessary connection, and you're going to continue to have libertarian writers in the genre of science fiction. And you see that with, you have the Prometheus Awards. You have an isolated, separate libertarian sci-fi award that is given every year because there's just so much libertarian science fiction. You have publishing houses that half their writers are libertarians, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it caught my attention, and I really wanted to dig deep and explore it. And I found that there really is a rich history of libertarianism in science fiction. Yeah, there are so many things, really. I would say that if I had to rank order them, one of the most important things in libertarianism is that, unlike conservatism, unlike leftism or progressivism, um, liber- I apologize for that. I don't know why that's coming through. Um, Libertarianism is about choice. It's about freedom. It's about market solutions. It's not about restrictionism. It's not about protectionism. It's not about boundaries and borders. It is about, you'll find that libertarians are open to things like genetic engineering and experimental drugs and nuclear power and cloning. And I would say that libertarianism is all about technological optimism. And it's very difficult to conceive of a sort of ardently sort of Burkean conservative science fiction author, because, as the professor Alicia Bashir from University of Pittsburgh puts it, sci-fi is the genre that considers what strange new beings we might become, what mechanical forms we might invent for our bodies, what networks and systems might nourish or tap our life energies, and what machine shells might contain our souls. And tradcons run for the hills. It's about openness. It's about radical new ideas. And I think one of the other things that's often overlooked is that libertarianism has never fully been tried. I know that's something that the socialists and the Marxists like to say, but libertarianism really actually has never been tried. And so far-flung futures, dystopian and utopian worlds, space operas that explore different galaxies and planets and different ways of living and different modes of life and different organizational structures. This is the perfect place. Science fiction is the perfect place to explore what a libertarian government might look like. So there's definitely all of that. But one other thing that I would say is really important. One of the reasons you see that there's a kind of libertarian ethos in science fiction, even when the fiction's being written by someone who's would consider themselves to be left wing, is that you often see that dystopian fiction is a genre which by its very nature takes on a libertarian flavor. Dystopian fiction is almost always going to be science fictional because the dystopian elements almost always have futuristic connotations or is involved with how the technology is being used to spy on individuals or oppress them and things like that. And so totalitarianism, war, wide-scale oppression is almost always carried out by state force. And so typically the narrative, the themes that will run throughout a dystopian novel are going to be about freedom from negative liberty, voluntarism, natural rights, right? Things that oppose that oppressive force. And things like that. So I would say that that's a good start for us. I think that the connection between science fiction and liberty is certainly a necessary one and is tied to certain fundamentals of the genre. Openness to experience. Libertarians are very open-minded. They believe in competition and freedom to pursue your own ends and things like that. So I would say that that's a kind of a basket of things that that can kind of explain why there are so many libertarian science fiction authors. Yeah, I mean, some of that is tied to the elements that are necessary in the sort of Campbellian story arc. I think in many cases, the stories that we tell, the meta stories that we tell, are inherently optimistic as a society, anyways. But I think that's especially true of, I think libertarianism in general is an optimistic outlook. As you said, when you read a work of dystopian fiction, the heroes oftentimes win in the end. It's very rare. I mean, 1984 is an example of a book that ends in a very bleak fashion. But I think that you're right. There's a technological optimism. There's a rugged individualism that says that the individual is not all he or she can be, and that just given the right amount of freedom, removing the sort of necessary obstacles, the individual left alone can fully flourish in a society that values life, liberty, and property. So I do think that there's something there to that you're saying, that there's a kind of optimism that you see in the works of Robert Heinlein. There's an optimism that you see in many of these dystopian works of fiction. And I think that you see that because libertarianism is an outlook that values choice, freedom, problem solving, the idea that we're not just locked into our class, we're not just locked into our race, we're not just locked into these old sort of unmovable systems, fixed systems, that there's movement, that there's mobility, and that the individual freed from arbitrary constraints can pursue their own happiness. And I think happiness is something that you see in the idea of happiness and what it would take is something you see in all libertarian science fiction, or at least most of it. Yeah, I think that's true. I think you see with traditional literary fiction, it's mostly set in the present day world. It's set in the historical past. In the past, things have already occurred and taken place. There's not as much room to play. Science fiction makes it much easier for authors to explore, to create, to make things happen that are not currently possible. Um, uh, I don't know about you, but living in America right now, it's very difficult to imagine the United States ever going back to being a kind of country with limited government and that same sort of entrepreneurial spirit that you saw in the 19th and mid 20th centuries, late 20th centuries. It's hard to see our society going back to that. You get a blank slate with science fiction. You get to create the world over from scratch, and that sort of thing. And also, one of the things that's overlooked is that one of the most sort of popular trends in science fiction in general is this idea of the competent man or even the competent woman. This 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 individual. You see this even in Andy Weir's The Martian. You have one man. And you have the planet of Mars, and he has to use his reason. There's a reason that the world's #1 libertarian magazine is called Reason magazine, because it's oftentimes science fiction is about the heroic individual having to reason their way through obstacles that are put in their way in outer space, right? If you can't, fix your spaceship, you're in a lot of trouble because you die if you can't fix your spaceship when you're in the middle of nowhere. If you're Andy Weir, if you're the main character of The Martian, you need to be able to grow plants. You need to be able to start civilization over from scratch. So a lot of science fiction is that Western frontier tradition of fiction that you saw in the early dime novels and in the pulp fiction. It's taking those themes of the sort of frontier Western and applying them to space, right? Boldly going where no one has gone before, and then creating civilization, creating order out of chaos. And I think that's something that appeals to libertarians, especially. Yeah, and one interesting thing is that there's a show out there, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's by Ridley Scott, something about masters of science fiction. I forget the title, but it's a documentary series by Ridley Scott about the way in which science fiction authors like Mary Shelley, like Isaac Asimov, like Robert Heinlein, have in many ways driven the science rather than the other way around. So the whole documentary series explores how ideas from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, um, scientists have been chasing the fruition of those ideas for a really long time. So things like cloning, things like stem cells, and things like that, prosthetics, that sort of Mary Shelley implanted in the popular imagination. And then scientists are asking the question, well, how can this be done? And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, of course, the answer is, well, Victor Frankenstein is a scientific genius. There's no government to put obstacles in his way. He studies the ancient alchemical masters like Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus, and he uses his reason and his innovation and his creativity to create life anew. And that whole documentary series is about, in many ways, how science fiction has driven scientific innovation rather than the other way around, that it's science fiction authors dreaming up where science could go in the future and scientists chasing that. And he makes that sustained case over the course of that entire documentary. Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, if you think about Reagan, Reagan grew up reading science fiction. He loved science fiction films. He read avidly. He read the John Carter of Mars stories, and Reagan, of course, was an actor in all of these genre films and B movies and things like that. And so, being an actor, Reagan had this very dramatic sense of what was possible. And in his mind, there was nothing odd about having a network of orbiting battle stations shooting lasers at um, intercontinental ballistic missiles in the middle of the Cold War, to make sure that you could shoot down any, like thing that threatened your country. Reagan, of course, his critics. This is called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. His critics mockingly called it Star Wars because Reagan really did believe that it was possible to have something like this. People were saying it was like something out of a space opera novel, but you know, Reagan thought that it was possible. And in fact, one of the interesting things about that whole thing was that Reagan actually hired a bunch of science fiction authors to be on his citizens advisory on national space policy. He put people on there like Larry Niven, who is a libertarian. These are sci-fi authors. Jerry Pournelle, who is conservative libertarian. Jim Bain, who the Bain Books is named after Jim Bain. Bain Books is one of the publishing houses that publishes a lot of libertarian authors. Robert Heinlein, who was an ardent libertarian. Poul Anderson. They were all on Reagan's Citizen Advisory Council to try to make up the technical plans, right? The arguments, the phrases that Reagan would use to announce SDI to the public in 1983. These were written by libertarian sci-fi authors. And so many people just don't know the history about how influential that has been. And how in many ways science fiction drives policy and drives the science rather than the other way around. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, and I would say it's a healthy distrust of state power. I suppose you can look at it like that, or you could look at it how I do, which is that libertarianism is about the idea that the burden of proof should always be on government to explain why they need to take away my fundamental liberties that precede government. The purpose of government is the protection of natural rights. Certainly in the West and in the American tradition, America gets its foundational principles in large part from folks like Montesquieu and Locke. It's about saying that the burden of proof is on you, government, to explain why it is absolutely necessary for you to take away my liberties rather than me having to make the argument that you shouldn't take away my liberties. The burden of proof is on you. I don't have to prove that negative. For me, a libertarian is someone who believes that people know best how to make their own choices and how to run their own lives. A libertarian believes that society is best organized when government gets out of people's way and sticks to what it's best at, which is protecting our life, liberty, and property, our negative rights. And it's about the idea that the organizing unit of society should not be the group, it should not be the state, it should not be even the family. That's a conservative idea, which is fine. But libertarians believe that the fundamental organizing unit of society should be the individual, and that the government should be basically a night watchman state, right? A minimal state, protecting citizens from foreign and domestic threats and giving citizens as much as possible voluntarism, choice, right? Follows the non-aggression principle, reason, freedom of association, free markets. And I think those things are very optimistic desires. And I think I see it as an optimistic thing. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I do. So I think a lot of it has to do with openness to change. As I pointed out in my article, when you actually do a study of who watches science fiction films and who reads science fiction literature, it skews heavily to people who possess a psychometric personality trait called openness to experience. So people who are open to new ideas, to new experiences, to travel, to art that pushes boundaries and taboos, are often liberals and libertarians. And I would say also that it's because most innovation happens in the free market when individuals are free to pursue their own ends. And an example of someone like Elon Musk, this is someone with all the odds stacked against him who is succeeding at being innovative despite our big government, despite our restrictionist policies, despite high taxes, despite states that are hostile to his very existence and the existence of his various companies. The slogan in America right now on both the left and the right is break up big tech, break up big business, break up big industry. People come down hard on Ayn Rand, but you're kind of starting to see, and I know people say this all the time. People said this in the 20th century. It's one of the reasons Reagan was elected, but you're starting to see a slide into that, anti-competition, anti-freedom of association, populism, just destroy these companies, break them up, distribute all the fruits, and all of that sort of thing. But I think that a big part of this is that innovation happens when individuals are free to pursue their own ends, engage in competition, and respond to market incentives. And so I guess that's what I would say to that. Yeah. I do think that's accurate. And for anyone who's interested in why that probably is accurate, you probably, I would recommend to read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Obviously, for anyone who's read that book is advancing something called moral foundations theory, which is basically the idea that we're born with these certain moral foundations, that certain people are predisposed to be more conservative for a variety of reasons, and certain people are predisposed to be more liberal or more libertarian. And I do think that is the case And I think, you know, as with most things, some of it is shaped by genetics, some of it is shaped by culture, and how you grow up and things like that. But I do think that some people are predisposed to hold some beliefs rather than other beliefs. Just to answer your question concisely, yeah. Yeah, there's two sides to that coin, I would say, because you do see science fiction, like you know, Isaac Asimov's Foundation, where everything really is outdated. It hasn't aged very well. They're making it into a show. Apple is, nevertheless. But you know, science fiction writers of the 50s often predicted a future in which people were flying in these ships that could travel near the speed of light, and yet they're still watching. They're still using cassettes or playing records or you know, using you know, using film reels and tapes and microfilm and things like that. So it kind of, it works both ways. But to answer your question, I do think yes, it does have a staying power, and certain authors are better at it than others. Frank Herbert's Dune, for example, runs on this premise. It is so deeply far into the future. It runs on this premise that eventually we become so powerful and technologically advanced that our AI robot overlords take us over and we fight a war to free ourselves from them, the Butlerian Jihad. And then so we learn a lesson from that, and we decide never to make computers in the likeness of man's mind. And so what you see in Frank Herbert's Dune is an intentionally far-flung future in which the technology in some areas is super advanced, and in other areas it isn't advanced. But I agree with your point. I think sci-fi has a real staying power. If you enter bookstores in the United States and you enter the fantasy and sci-fi section, those book sections are growing. The literary book sections are shrinking. The genre sections are exploding. Sci-fi and fantasy are selling really well right now, and the section in the bookstores keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they inspire fan fiction, for example, in a way that literary fiction doesn't. Right, so there's this element of fandom as well that enters into it with science fiction, and I think there's also an aspect of escapism as well when things are contentious in the culture right now. America is extremely polarized in a way that it hasn't been since probably the Civil War, or at least 1968. It's actually really, really refreshing to escape into science fiction as a kind of release, as a kind of catharsis from that. But I agree with your point. I think just by its very nature, science fiction is, and it depends what type of science fiction. There's hard science fiction, there's soft science fiction, there's all sorts of there's first contact novels, but it's forward looking. And that's another way that we can connect this back to libertarianism is forward looking. It's not afraid to confront difference. It's not afraid to ask what we might become, and it's not going to run in the other direction from that. Sci-fi is by its very nature, it's forward looking. I particularly quite love hard science fiction, which is all about extrapolating out from the present time, looking at technological trends. Where are we now with AI, with cell phones, with communications technology? Where are we now with our medical technology? What do our governing systems look like? And then logically extrapolating that out into the future. I think one of the best science fiction authors working today, his name is Alistair Reynolds. And he actually is an astrophysicist. And before he wrote his first book, he was working as an astrophysicist for the European Space Agency, Space Union, whatever it was, and became a science fiction author because it turned out he was incredibly good at looking forward and predicting what, for example, how are we going to live longer in the future? How would that happen? Are we going to ever be able to upload our consciousnesses, right? Well, in Alistair Reynolds, there's alpha and beta simulations. So once people die, you can actually save their consciousness and have them in these capsules and have conversations with them. Um, so I would say that the good work being done in science fiction, there's a reason why it's being done by libertarians and by liberals and progressives. These are people who aren't afraid to look to the future and ask these really hard questions about what it's going to look like. I do too. I think it's one of the best things about genre fiction is that it promotes and encourages that sort of thing. I was listening to an interview with George R. R. Martin a couple of weeks ago or a couple of days ago, and he was explaining how eventually his fans came to know more than him about the book because he just sits in his office and thinks up these ideas and tries to make them consistent and writes them down. He has these fans that have read his book 30 times. And he said eventually I had to break down and just hire two of them because they were catching things in my work. One of them's name is Ilio, and the other one's name is Linda. I forget their last names, but he has these two super fans who are noticing things like, well, the horse is the wrong sex. You made it this sex here. You made it that there. Were you meaning to do that? Probably not. This person has a different eye color. Did you notice that? And so I think that is a really fantastic element of it. You don't see the same thing. You see fans, right? People who really love Toni Morrison or people who really love Cormac McCarthy, but you see it to a totally different degree. And I think it's really important that science fiction and fantasy literature are culture producing, right? And a lot of this actually pertains to the history, the unique history of science fiction, going all the way back to the pulps. When you science fiction, yes, proto science fiction started with folks like Jules Verne and Mary Shelley, but science fiction gets really big in the 20th century with the pulps, and it kind of starts with these magazines, and these magazines are asking for queries from their readers. They are allowing their readers to participate in little games that they put in these magazines, like Astounding Magazine or Amazing Magazine or Weird Science Magazine or whatever. There are a bunch of these pulp magazines. And the editors are working together to try to shape the tastes of the audiences. The audiences, in turn, are trying to shape the direction of the magazines. There was a period there between like 1930 and 1960 where the magazines themselves had a loyal fan base. The authors themselves didn't have the fan base. The pulp magazines had a fan base, and that's how you get the golden age of science fiction. And then, of course, you get the birth of science fiction as a genre is intimately tied into the convention model, right? You'll notice that fantasy and sci-fi have these conventions in every city, and fans show up, as you pointed out, dressed in costumes. They attend author panels where the authors explain their writing style or their motivation. I think that's one of the beautiful things about genre fiction, but especially science fiction and fantasy. And I think also that is why you're seeing sci-fi shows, Max, show up one after the other, whether it's Game of Thrones or The Expanse. The Expanse was based on a series of novels by James S.A. Corey. And just one after the other, these shows are coming out. You mentioned Stargate. I tend to like, Battlestar Galactica, The Expanse, things like that. So yeah, I think there's really rich soil, I would say, in the culture right now. I think people are really into this escapism, dreaming up what the future might look like, and people get pretty pumped about it. Yeah, I do think that's the case, and I think that went overlooked for a really long time. There is so much science fiction out there that is literary, that is smart, that is highbrow, that's sophisticated. That's kind of what the new wave was all about. It was all about kind of trying to take that sort of early Campbellian golden age sci-fi and make it less sort of Marvel action blockbuster, cheap thrills, and try to make it more nuanced, more sophisticated. Writers like Ursula Le Guin, right? In her book *The Dispossessed*, which, by the way, speaking of libertarian science fiction, is about an anarchist society and what that would look like and how that would come about. Novels like *The Moon is a Harsh Mistress*. These are works of literature, right? And I would just say that that was something that was overlooked for a really long time. Is this idea that, well, this is just cheap stuff that that children like, that that is just cheap thrills or something like that. So much of science fiction is brilliantly written. Some of it's literary. The soft science fiction is highly literary. You have even works of libertarian science fiction. No Truce with Kings, The Great Explosion. I mentioned The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, but also Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein, and also his Starship Troopers. These aren't just fun; they're well-written books. And I would say that, yeah, that's true. That you see an element of organization, of technical brilliance, of command of the elements of storytelling that you don't see in a lot of. So, for example, I think I think you don't see that highbrow literary quality with detective fiction still, not since Poe, I suppose you could say. There are some great mystery writers, but I would say that that's not there. Romance is another genre. It doesn't quite have the literary quality of fantasy and science fiction. So I would say, yeah, that too. That's a really good point that you make. You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It was fun.